Hi there. Welcome at the screencast on certificate authentication on Azure Active Directory, and then using that certificate to authenticate your application, which then allows you to execute actions on Office 365. This is important whenever you want to create an application that has application permissions, and you can think of, for example, maintenance, activating features, deactivating features, but you can also, for example, upload reports, remove files, update files, change the site title, all that kind of stuff. Because every now and then you need to do some maintenance or have some type of daemon application that automatically uploads files to SharePoint. So this screencast will walk you through on how to, first of all, create an application, use certificates to authenticate, and also how to register your application in Azure Active Directory and assign permissions for, in this case, SharePoint. I've created a sample application that's over here, and I will walk you through on what's in there. So when we think about certificates for authentication, then the first thing we need to be able to do is to load certificates. And these certificates can be stored in the certificate store or on disk. So if you want to know where the certificate store is, you can just start over here, type mmc.exe, there we are. Add a snap-in, file, add remove snap-in, then we can select the certificate snap-in. I'll use my user account in this case, there we go. And here we will find all my personal certificates, here we are. That's a location to store a certificate, but sometimes your application, for example, when you run it inside Azure or on a machine that you do not own or are not able to access, you might want to store these certificates on disk. So you want to deploy your certificate along with your application. So you also want to be able to load the certificate from disk. So that's why I created a certificate utility which contains two methods. Method number one, load certificate by using its thumbprint, and every certificate has a thumbprint. So you can define the thumbprint, the store name, and the store location. Like I just showed in the MMC console application, that you can indeed, in this case, load a certificate from the current user store and then the my, and that's the same, that's this one. That's the current user, my is the personal certificates. There we are. So that's method number one. What it will do, it will create a store object, then tries to find a certificate by its thumbprint. There we are. If it's the certificate collection does not contain any certificates, we just throw an exception that we cannot find a certificate with this thumbprint. And if it contains more than one certificate, which means that we have more than one certificate with that thumbprint, and we are not able to select the correct certificate. And if none of these are true, we will just select the first and the only certificate that we found using the certificate find. The other method in here is the load certificate, where we specify the certificate path. This is the file system path and the certificate password. If you install a certificate in the store, you have to define the password, and every application that is able to access this certificate will also receive the password in a sense. So when we've stored a file on disk, we of course have to also specify the password to use to indeed sign, for example, messages or to authenticate. So this is my helper utility class actually to load certificates. That's number one. Once we have a certificate, however, we also want to be able to connect to Azure Active Directory, present the certificate, and then retrieve an access token. For this, I created the token helper utility. This one, here we are. And this token helper needs first of all a client ID, which is the ID of my application. We'll get to that later. The tenant, so which Azure Active Directory should I connect to? and of course the certificate to use to indeed authenticate my application. So in the constructor we pass in the client ID, the tenant, and the certificate to use for authentication. And then whenever we need to get a token, we have two methods over here. Acquire token async by passing in the request URL, and actually the same type of method, acquire token async, by passing a URI. And these are just helper methods. So once we have a certificate and we have a token helper with which we can retrieve a access token, we would like to use these access tokens in our communication with SharePoint. Communication with SharePoint, we've got two options, basically. Option number one is to use the client-side object model. And the client-side object model, you have to always create a client context by passing in the URL of the site, and then start sending a request load data. Whenever we load data, however, we also always want to make sure that we pass in this access token. So the token helper allows us to fetch an access token, and we will use this access token in our client context. That's why I created the client context utility. The client context utility allows us to create a new client context by passing in the site URL, just like in the basic standard CSOM objects. But in my case, I also pass in the token helper, an instance of the token helper. And within the executing web request, we use this token helper to first of all acquire a token, an access token, and then on every request we add this authorization header, which is bearer, and then the access token. We do have to do this on every request. The reason for that is that whenever we receive an access token, it has a lifespan. It will be valid for like 15 minutes. Luckily for us, the library that we use, the ADO library, which I will show you later on, will validate if our token is still valid when we call acquire token async. If it's not valid, it will indeed go to Azure Active Directory and fetch a new one. If it is valid, it will use the cache. So there's no reason to then go back to Azure Active Directory and fetch this token. It can use the token in cache. So that's one way to communicate with SharePoint, using a client context, and then on the execute request or load, we can pass in this access token. Another way to communicate with SharePoint online is through REST. So we can call the REST endpoint and then get our information. And when we use REST, it actually works almost exactly the same as the client context. We have to pass in our authorization header. So I created an HTTP web request utility that has a getResponse extension method. So it extends the HTTP web request with a method called getResponse, but we then pass in the token helper. Again, it's the same token helper. But what we will do, on every getResponse, we will first acquire a token async, which will, if there's no token in cache, go to Azure Active Directory and fetch an access token. If there is a token in cache, it will use that token if it's valid, and then set the authorization request header and pass in the access token. So these are actually our helper methods. We have one utility to load the certificates, one utility class to indeed connect to Azure Active Directory and fetch our access tokens, one utility class to easily create a CSOM client context, which we can use to fetch information from SharePoint while passing in the access token, and one HTTP web request utility, which contains an extension method that will also add the authorization header and passing in the access token. That being said, we would now first need to have a certificate. Now, how do we get these certificates? I mentioned before, these certificates can either be stored on disk, for example, or in the certificate store. But the main part is that we need to get a certificate, and we can use self-signed certificate for that. Self-signed certificates can be created by using the Make Cert utility. Make Cert utility is part of the Windows SDK, but if you install Visual Studio, most of the times you can select to install the SDK as well, standard it is, and you will have the Make Cert utility available on your system already. If you want to use it, you can open the developer command prompt. Another thing that we need to do is when we create a certificate is think about how we want to use it. But I will show you by demonstration. Let's go to the Start menu and I will type in developer. And what you will see that I can open the developer command prompt for Visual Studio right now. I have to right click it and run it as administrator. There we are. So the working directory is now Windows System 32. Makes it a bit difficult, so let's navigate to the root. There we are. So the Make Cert utility. Let's call this, because our sample application here will fetch the SharePoint title, we will create a new certificate like this. Paste it out. What happens here, we use a common name for the certificate called SharePoint Title App, which makes it easier for us to find it back in our certificate store. If we would not specify a name, it would get a GUID, difficult to identify. What also specifies that I want to have a private key file and a certificate. The private key part can be used to indeed authenticate, and the certificate, that's the public part, can be used to validate the authentication. We need a length of 2048, and when we do not specify an end date, it will be valid till 2040. So we will still have a lot of time to use that certificate. So let's first create both the private key file and the certificate. It will of course ask for a password, because the certificate can be used for authentication. The certificate needs to be secured with a password. In a production environment, you would of course use a good password. In this sample, in this demo, I will use pass@word1. Hit enter. We'll ask for it one more time. Pass@word1. And I now have a private key and a public key. Private key in the PVK file and the public in the SIR file. Let's see if everything worked out. We will navigate to my directory, my working directory, which is C right now. And indeed, I have a certificate and a private key. In Windows environments, it's easier to use the key and use a certificate when you combine the both in a PFX file. The easiest way to create a PFX file is to use the private key to PFX file utility. Here we are. No, let me change that. I will copy this one out. Hit it over here. What you will see here is I tell this utility to use the PVK file that I created over here, the certificate file that I created over here, and I want the result to be stored in a PFX file, and the password is pass@word1. In a production environment, I definitely hope you use a different password. So of course you have to change this line to indeed include your password and the files that you created. Let's hit enter. There we go. If everything went well, we should now have a PFX file on our file system. Let's have a look at that. Indeed, there it is. That's our PFX file, Personal Information Exchange. Okay, we can now either store this certificate or install this certificate in our certificate store, or we can load it from disk. I will show you both versions. So when we have this PSX file, we can either double click it or right click and hit install. When we do so, it will ask us which store to install it to. If your application will be running under this user's account, you can use the current user. Hit next. You need to verify if indeed it's the same file, standard it is. And now we have to specify the password. This password we need to specify because when we install it for this user, the user can fetch the certificate from the store without supplying the password again. So this is a one-time installation where we say, okay, this certificate can be used by this user, and it does not need to specify a password again. We specify it right now, pass at word 1. And in this case, we do not want to mark this key as exportable, because then an administrator of that system would be able to export our key. So let's keep it like this. Hit next. It will ask us where to store the certificate. I would like to specify that I want to store it in the personal folder. Completing the wizard, and I hit finish. The import was successful. We can verify that by indeed looking at our personal store certificates and refresh it, and indeed we have the SharePoint title app certificate over here. So that's a way, that's how you store the certificate in a certificate store. We can also, depending on where we deploy the application, add the certificate to our solution. I will show you how to do that as well. So right click my solution, I will go to Open Folder and File Explorer, and I have it over here. This is my Solution Explorer folder. I then navigate to the location where I stored the PFX, and I simply copy it over here, copy here. And now I have the certificate in my solution folder. We can close this out for now. To display the certificate over here, I need to first of all show all files. And then indeed we have the PFX file over here. So I include it in my project and stop showing hidden files. And one important thing to do here is that whenever we deploy the application, we also want to deploy the PFX file. So instead of having do not copy over here, I will change that to copy if newer or copy always. So with that being in place, we have our application and we have the certificate. What we now need to do is we need to register our application, and we need to specify that our application will authenticate using this certificate. To do that, we need some information about the certificate. This information can be gathered by executing some PowerShell commands. So let's open PowerShell. There we go, Windows PowerShell. Oh, excuse me. Always open it as an administrator. Run as administrator. And there we are. And here's the code I use to get the information from my certificate. So what I will do, I will import the certificate, and I only need the public part because we are going to register and only supply public details of our certificate. You never publish your private key part. Remember that? So I have some code over here which will load the file, get the raw data, get the thumbprint, and some key ID. There we are. We will copy this, get back to our PowerShell window, hit enter over here, and here we have all the details that are required to register our application. So let's continue. Let's go to how we register our application. Over here you see my Office 365 Admin Center, and down here at Admin Center I have an Azure AD link. When I click that, it will load my Azure Active Directory like this. And this is the Azure Active Directory in the tenant that is connected to my Office 365 environment. And here we have applications. So what we need to do is we need to register our own application. So let's click Add. That's a good start. And right now we are developing the application, so I can say add an application my organization is developing. There we go. Give it a name, SP Title App. And in this case, we have to select Web Application and the Web API. I know it might sound a bit awkward because when you write a console application, you can also choose for native client application. But the difficulty with that is that a native client application you cannot assign application permissions to native client applications. You can only do permission delegation, and in that way you will always need a user. With a web application and a web API, we can assign application-specific permissions. So the application can use these permissions and execute tasks without a user being logged in, a Office 365 user. So it has its own permission. So let's select Web Application and the Web API. We hit Next, a sign-on URL. In our case, we do not use that. But for registration, we need to define a valid URL. So we just specify SP title app. Here we go. That's a valid one. We can just copy and paste it out over here. There we are. SP title app. And there we are. Both are valid. So hit Next. So what we have right now is we register our application in Azure Active Directory. Even though it's registered, it does not have any permissions yet. What it does have is an ID. And we need that ID because when our application is going to connect to Azure Active Directory, it will first have to tell which application it is. That is a key. We can find that. We can open this one out. Access Web APIs and other applications. And here you see update your code with your client ID. In my solution, I prepared that. So let's go to the properties, the client ID. I can store that one over here. So that's the client ID that we need. Okay. So our application is registered. It has a client ID, but it does not have permissions yet. So we need to assign permissions to our application. So let's go to Configure. Over here, we can scroll all the way down, and here we see permissions to other applications. So let's add application. What application? Well, in our case, we are trying to fetch the title of SharePoint sites, so we can add SharePoint Online permissions. There we go. We hit OK. So we did add the application, but we did not add any permissions yet. So we want application-specific permissions. We want our application to be able to fetch SharePoint titles, site titles. So we select the drop-down for application permissions, and we select read items in all site collections, because we want to be able to read information. Of course, if your application would do some maintenance, add some features, or activate some features, you might need to request full control. Always make sure that you get only those permissions that you actually require. It's the least privilege. There we go. Read items in all site collections. That's the only one I read right now. So I'm done. Save this out. And our application is being updated. So here we have it. We have our Office 365 SharePoint Online with one permission. We have the client ID. Everything said and done. However, we still need to tell Azure Active Directory that our application is using a certificate for authentication. Right now we registered the application, but we did not specify how our application will authenticate itself. We can do that by updating the application manifest. We can find it over here, Manage Manifest. When we click that, we can download the manifest. There we are. We click Download Manifest, and once it's there, we can open it. Let's open it with Visual Studio. That's fine for now. So what do we need to enter right there? That's the information we got from our PowerShell. So when we look at the manifest, we have a property over here on this JSON object called key credentials. And in that property, we need to specify how we will authenticate. So I will add some code over there. Here we have it, the manifest part. Copy this one out, put it over here. So what do we need right now? The thumbprint, key ID, and base64 value. We have this PowerShell window over here. So we first of all need the base64 thumbprint. That's this one. So copy this one out and paste it over here. We have the key ID. That's just a GUID. We can paste any GUID. But I created one in my script, so we'll use that one over here. There we are. And then the base64 value, that's the raw data. Here, this one, raw data, but base64 encoded. Copy this one. There we go. And we paste it out over here. Look at that, there we are. So we now changed our manifest and told the Azure Active Directory that our application will authenticate by using a certificate that is this thumbprint base64 encoded in this raw data. Save it out. So that's our local manifest file. But of course, to tell Azure Active Directory, we need to click manifest again, manage manifest, and we will now going to upload the manifest. Browse for the file, and we navigate to the file that we just updated. So hit open. Next. So there we are. We created the title application. We did set the permissions for SharePoint, and we told Azure Active Directory that we're going to authenticate using a certificate. So that's a good start. So let's go back to our application right now and see what else we can do. So this one can be closed. We have this one over here. So let's see what my program is wanting to do. Let's go over here. Well, actually my program is trying to load the client context of a specific site. So let's see what SharePoint site we have. Let's go. I have idoiot.sharepoint.com. There we are. So the site URL that I want to fetch a title of is idoiot.sharepoint.com. We can see that it's called Motion 10 Team Site. We'll see that back when we run the application, everything goes well. So let's go back to the settings over here. The site URL indeed, https //idoiot.sharepoint.com. The tenant, this is a very important one. So our authentication does not take place on SharePoint. Our authentication is against our Azure Active Directory in our Azure tenant. So we do not specify idoiot.sharepoint.com over here, but we need to look at our tenant. Let's go over here, which is idoiot on Microsoft.com. So copy that one out, go to Visual Studio, and we'll copy that over here. So this is our tenant. And now we have two options. Like I mentioned in the beginning, our certificate utility can either fetch our certificate from the store or from disk. When we fetch the information from store, the certificate, we use the thumbprint. Where do we get the thumbprint from? Over here, I also, in my PowerShell script, I also extract the thumbnail. So we can simply paste it out here. There we are. That's it. If we want to load the certificate from disk, we need to specify the path. So in this case, because I'm going to show you both techniques, I'll also specify the path. As we copy the file to the root directory of our application, we can simply use the name of our file without the entire path. If you want to store this file, for example, on the C drive somewhere on the root, you would have to specify the full path. But right now, the file name is all we need, so SharePoint title app.pfx, that's fine. And of course, the password. In a production environment, you would never store the password in a configuration file like this, because everybody who has access to the configuration file on the PSFX can now pretend it's your application. So make sure you store this password in a safe location, like a credential store or something like that. But for this demo, I'll of course just type in my password, PassEdward1. Okay, so all settings are done. Let's go to our program. So how does our program look like? First of all, we will fetch the site URL, the client ID, and the tenant. And we'll also use the certificate utility to then get the certificate by its thumbprint. So when we do that, we can use that certificate again to call our token helper, create a new token helper instance. We pass in the client ID, the tenant, and the certificate. With that, our library can connect to Azure Active Directory, passing the client ID and the certificate, and it will then be able to get a access token. How we use that is over here in a get site title with CSUM. We use the client context utility and create a client context for the site URL, and we use the pass in the token helper, which we can then use to add an access token to every request that we do. So whenever we call execute query on this context, it will pass in the access token. We call load on the web, and we then display the title. With REST, get site title with REST, we create an HTTP web request where we pass in the site URL and of course the path to our REST endpoint. We want to fetch the web title. The method is get, and we accept a return value of JSON. Then when we want to get a response, we call the get response, but then we call our extension method where we pass in the token helper. And that will of course ensure that in our request we will also add the access token. Once we get the value, we use JSON deserialization and get the title. What do we need for this? We need some NuGet packages. When we right-click our application, you will notice that I added 3 NuGet packages. Which NuGet packages? Well, because we work with the Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, we need the Azure Active Directory client libraries. The easiest way to find those is when you click Browse over here and type ADOL. When you search for that, you will notice that you will have it right here. So that's what we use for authentication. Because we also use CSOM in our application to connect to SharePoint, we would need to have at the CSOM libraries Microsoft SharePoint Online.CSOM. When we work with REST, we get JSON results returned, and the easiest way to work with JSON is to add in the library to parse JSON. That's a Newtonsoft JSON library. When we look at this, indeed, all these 3 libraries are installed. So let's see if it works right now. So what we did, we created an application, created the certificates, then registered our application. We registered our certificate, the public key part, the public part, and then we set the properties over here and see if everything works. Let's click start over here for debugging. There we go. So the first thing it did is we got the settings. We read the settings out and we have them over here. Then we will use the certificate utility to load the certificate by its thumbprint. Let's go through that. There we go. We open the store and then get through everything. Let's see if that works out. Indeed, it works out. We have a single certificate which will be returned. So then we need to create a new token helper. And the token helper, we will pass the client ID, tenant and certificate. Let's go to the token helper. Let's go over here. There we are. And let's see if it happens. Yep, there we are. Uses the client assertion certificate, creates everything and creates an authentication context. There we are. Then we will create, let's go back over here. We call get site title with CSOM, so we will create a client context. That's what we do over here. You'll see we create a new client context. We create a client context like we always do. So just client context equals new client context, and we pass in the site URL. What we also do, however, is that we register an event handler on the executing web request, so that on every request that we make, we will call the token helper to acquire a token asynchronously and use that token as an authorization header to our request. So we can just load the context, nothing happens yet, but whenever we go to execute query, that's the moment where we send out our request to SharePoint. You will notice that, boom, here's our debug point hit. We will use the token helper to require a token, and we use that token in our request. We added it. So indeed, that works out. Needs a second request. There we are. So let's go to the get site title with REST. So we first need to create a web request. This web request we will pass in a URL, site URL, but also API/web/title. That's the endpoint we want to call. The method is a get method, and we accept application/JSON and OData verbose. That's there to tell that we want more information to SharePoint. That's fine. Then the more important part over here is when we hit the get response. The get response uses the token helper again to get a access token and add that to the request. Let's see if that happens. So I have the breakpoint over here. So what happens if we hit F5? It's being called over here. It uses the acquired token async to get a access token. In this case, because we already fetched the access token before, it will use the one in cache. And when we continue over here, you will notice we will just add a request header with the access token. There we are. And it will then execute the get response. There we are. And this is it. So we now have an application that can indeed use a certificate to get information from SharePoint. Okay, one other thing I promised to show you is how you can use a certificate that's stored on file. Well, because we have the certificate utility, that's pretty easy. We just comment out this part, and we uncomment this part. There we are. I get the path for my settings and I get the password, and I use my certificate utility to load the certificate from the path by passing the password. Let's see if everything works out again. So let's go over here and see if it works out. Did we get a certificate? Indeed, we got our certificate. And we can now just continue, and we'll see that indeed everything else will go exactly like it did before. Load the context, and when we execute the query, there we go. We will get the token. With the token, we will connect to SharePoint. Same with the site title with REST. We will get a response. There we are. We will use the token again. There we are. We will add it to our request, and boom, there we are. So that is how you work with certificates, client certificates, to authenticate against Azure Active Directory.